Well, this is hilarious. Former press secretary for Donald Trump, Kaleigh McEnany, who's now a Fox News host, made a point on Fox News that made Donald Trump very triggered and caused him to rage about her on Truth Social. And before getting into this clip, just need to remind you, so you have the proper context, of the loyalty shown to Trump by Kaleigh McEnany throughout her time as his press secretary. She would publicly, repeatedly humiliate herself on behalf of his lies. And despite that, she says the tiniest little criticism of Trump and he turns on her. A rhino is what he'll call her, as we've seen so often with Donald Trump. If you even dare to take a break from praising Trump for 1 second, even if it's to take a breath, he'll call you a rhino. So with that being said, here is Kaleigh McEnany on Fox News.
The former president, Kaleigh, in the close, it seemed like the Trump campaign was pretty disciplined. They hit the immigration issue a lot at his rallies. And we saw his pitch at the town hall and the speech in Iowa. This was a different speech. He is a fighter. He punches back. He obviously didn't like the speech he heard from Nikki Haley. But he's also, at some point, has to get into general election, going after independents and maybe disaffected Democrats. And this speech probably wasn't that.
No, this speech was a speech to dispose of the last remaining competitor, if you could call it that. She's still significantly behind him. He's pulling a majority support. But to get her out of the race, I would suggest that adopting a general election tone is what you do at this point. And here's why I say this. This was actually a fairly good night for Joe Biden. When you look at our voter analysis, only 10% said, I would not vote for Joe Biden if he's the nominee. He won a plurality of voters who said he was too old. He won a majority of voters who are upset about the Gaza war. So the divides in the Democrat Party, and this is a small sample size, but perhaps aren't as stark as one would think. But when you look at the Republican Party, 7 in 10 Nikki Haley voters said, I would not vote for Trump. There was the Des Moines Register poll, 43% said, no, I wouldn't vote for Trump. If I'm Trump, I sit back and I exclusively focus on the general election. I take the posture of a presumptive nominee. I focus on number one, uniting the party, and number two, winning the independents, which Nikki Haley won 55 to 39%. That's what I would do. Nikki Haley, the closest margin is 30% in the states ahead. For all intents and purposes, he's the presumptive nominee.
So there, Kaleigh McEnany is willing to admit that it was a good night for Joe Biden last night, not only because he won in a state where he wasn't even on the ballot due to a DNC v. New Hampshire dispute, but he won nearly 70% of the vote because people wrote him in. And also, the exit polling yielded really good results as she was walking through in terms of New Hampshire voters' willingness to go out and vote for Joe Biden in the general election. Whereas, even though Trump did win easily, there are some bad signs for him. It does seem like there's a somewhat notable contingent of the GOP that will not go out to vote for Trump in the general. And that's the type of thing that can swing an election. And so Kaleigh's advice to Trump was essentially try to moderate yourself, and went over the independents and the Nikki Haley voters, etc. And Trump disagreed, writing on Truth Social, I don't need any advice from Rhino Kaleigh McEnany on Fox. Just had a giant victory over a badly failing candidate, bird brain, and she's telling me what I can do better. Save your advice for Nikki. So, again, someone who eviscerated her own integrity, Kaleigh McEnany, that is, in service of Donald Trump, is now a rhino because of that tiny little critique. Was it even a critique? It was more of just advice for going forward, but that was enough to set Trump off. And as you all know, Trump has a long history of turning on those who formerly worked for him, despite him saying that he hires the best people, then they are all terrible after working for him. And here is a stunning moment from an interview a while back that I've shown before, where Bret Baier, another Fox News host, reminds Trump to his face of just some of the people who worked for him and now are not in his good graces.
Your Vice President, Mike Pence, is running against you. Yeah. Your Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, she's running against you. Your former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said he's not supporting you. You mentioned National Security Advisor John Bolton. He's not supporting you either. You mentioned Attorney General Bill Barr, says you shouldn't be president again, calls you the consummate narcissist and troubled man. You recently called Barr a gutless pig. Your second Defense Secretary is not supporting you, called you irresponsible. irresponsible. This week, you and your White House called your White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, weak and ineffective and born with a very small brain. You called your acting White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, a born loser. You called your first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, dumb as a rock, and your first Defense Secretary, James Mattis, the world's most overrated general. You called your White House Press Secretary, Kaleigh McEnany, milquetoast, and multiple times you've referred to your Transportation Secretary, Elaine Chao, as Mitch McConnell's China-loving wife. So, why did you hire all of them in the first place?
Because I hired 10 to 1 that were fantastic.
And as I've said in the past, it's a devastating reflection on one's character when the very act of working alongside them causes people to be disturbed. So many people have walked away from the Trump administration and recounted the horrors of what they saw, and that's an indictment of who Trump is. And then, I never understand why Trump's followers just don't care. I mean, I do, they're in a cult, but, you know, abstractly, I don't get it. Obviously, Kaleigh McEnany started this segment, but she's not the best example of one of these enemies of Trump. She just barely nudged him. But many of the other people who worked alongside Trump are now outspoken advocates on behalf of the idea that Trump is dangerous. He's a dangerous person and should not be president, and a second term would be disastrous. And some were mentioned in that clip. And for Trump's followers, how does that not impact them? And it could impact them in two different ways. Either they could be concerned that Trump can't pick good people, thus he has horrible judgment because half of them come out and instantly reveal themselves to be evil Marxist, communist, radical left Biden operatives, or whatever Trump may call them. Or Trump's followers could trust what some other people have to say and be concerned with who Trump is. So don't trust the people, but judge Trump for picking them, or trust the people and judge Trump for being Trump. But neither happens with them. It's crazy. And as an example of what some of Trump's former staffers have to say about him, here are three: Alyssa Farah Griffin, Cassidy Hutchinson, and Sarah Matthews saying this.
In your mind, if Donald Trump became president again, what would a second Trump term look like?
Fundamentally, a second Trump term could mean the end of American democracy as we know it. And I don't say that lightly. We all witnessed him trying to steal a democratic election before and going to historic and unconstitutional lengths to do so. And that just shows that he's willing to basically break every barrier to get into power and to stay into power. But also, I'm very concerned about what the term would actually look like.
We don't need to speculate what a second Trump term would look like because we already saw it play out. To this day, he still doubles down on the fact that he thinks that the election was stolen and fraudulent. And then his rhetoric has just gotten increasingly erratic. I mean, he has literally called for things like doing away with parts of the Constitution, wanting to weaponize the DOJ to enact revenge on his political enemies.
The fact that he feels that he needs to lean into being a dictator alone shows that he is a weak and feeble man who has no sense of character and integrity and has no sense of leadership.
Everyone who is in the West Wing, and frankly a lot of cabinet secretaries, they know how dangerous Trump is. People who I have the deepest level of respect for, like my former boss, Vice President Mike Pence, he's seen more than any of us have seen. He knows more than any of us know. And I would just hope in this moment when we are less than a year out from, or basically a year out from the election, that he would think about speaking out more forcefully just about the unfitness of Donald Trump. This is not about politics. It's not about policy. It is about the character of the man who's the leader of the free world.
People who worked loyally alongside him are saying, we know him. He would end American democracy. He tried to when he attempted to block the peaceful transfer of power, and now he has, if you can believe it, even more horrific plans for a second term. But again, Trump's followers won't listen. Make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, and if you want to go a step further, you can become a member at lucabeasleyshow.com/membership. And podcast listeners, please rate and review the show.